Gentlemen, please take your seats. And I know that there will be some people coming in as the program commences, but we want to get started promptly because we have a very, very full program. My name is Mary Woolley. I'm the president of Research America, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to Research America's annual National Health Research Forum. The theme for our program today is straight talk. And that is exactly what we need these days. The goal is to speak candidly about the future of medical and health research. The medical and health research that is absolutely essential if we are going to achieve the health solutions that all of us, every single one of us, every patient, every family is waiting for, urgently waiting for. The need for medical progress, indeed, is palpable across this nation and around the world. The opportunity in science, meanwhile, has never been more promising, more real, and more within our grasp. And the eagerness to put innovation to work throughout our health and research ecosystem is so apparent. Everybody's ready, willing, and able to go. So what are we waiting for? And indeed, that's the question before us today. That's what we're going to hear straight talk about. And in addition to hearing from outstanding national leaders on this topic, we're going to have a chance to hear from all of you. We want you to engage, to ask questions, to talk to each other, and not to stop talking when you leave here, to continue that theme of straight talk as you engage your friends, your neighbors, your family, your colleagues, and importantly, the people you elect to office. Well, before we begin, I'd like to take just a minute to thank our sponsors today, the people who have made this program possible. Lilly is our lead sponsor, and thank you so much, Bart and Michelle and everyone at Lilly. Our panels today are sponsored by Celgene, Onyx Pharmaceuticals, and Colgate-Palmolive. Thank you all. Our wonderful meal is sponsored by Johnson & Johnson, Genentech, and the American Medical Association. We know it's going to be great. Thank you. Our media sponsors today are Politico and The Hill. We thank everyone, and we also thank our additional sponsors, the Duke University Health System, Northeast Ohio Medical University, and the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Now, finally, we're so pleased that WebMD is hosting a live webcast today of this program. So you'll be able to watch it again because it not only will be live, but we're going to be, both WebMD and we will be highlighting it, YouTube, social media, and all the rest. So there's lots more chances to revisit your favorite part of this program. But now it is my privilege to introduce the chair of the board of Research America and former Congressman, the Honorable John Edward Porter. John.
So let me add my welcome to all of you to today's annual National Health Forum. As Mary stated, the theme of this gathering is straight talk. Are we ready to speak forcefully and candidly to our elected officials about the problems they have created as a result of their inaction? Are you? To talk to them about the research that's not being conducted and the number of scientists leaving the profession, the missed opportunities, the lost jobs, the threat to our global competitiveness. As I've said repeatedly, we must be militant advocates, all of us, everyone in this room, all research stakeholders. We have to speak up with passion, pound on the table, Let our representatives know we are holding them accountable for the health and economic security of our nation. Congress must take, as I've said before many times, decisive action on tax and entitlement reform, end the sequester, protect funding for research, and advance the policies for private sector innovation. We can't allow them to continue to kick the can down the road. And if I want to give you some straight talk, I'll tell you what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that the government shuts down because they can't get together, that the American people get angry, that the stock market falls 1,000 points in a day, and that everyone says, this is ridiculous. They've carried on this way for so long, they either have to get the job done or they have to get out of the way. So, I know I shouldn't say things like that, but I get to say them. We will be facing a healthcare tsunami as costs continue to rocket and Alzheimer's, cancer, and other health threats claim more lives. Research America's polling show that a majority of Americans believe that research is part of the solution to rising healthcare costs. More than half are even willing to pay more taxes, provided it goes to support medical research. Americans understand the value of research. Do our elected officials recognize it as well? Are they willing to accept the decline of our research ecosystem as other countries ramp up their R&D investments? Are they willing to accept other countries taking the lead in science and innovation? Are we willing to accept that? I would guess the answer is no, but this will all come to fruition if they fail to change course. We've got to make them change course. Today's investments in research develop the therapies and cures for tomorrow. On that note, I am pleased to introduce Bart Peterson, the Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Communications at Lilly, our lead sponsor for today's program. Bart will deliver our keynote address that will help frame some of the discussion expected by the panelists and guests. Prior to joining Lilly, Bart was Managing Director at Strategic Capital Partners. He also served, and this is very important because he understands all of this, 2 terms as mayor of Indianapolis from 2000 to 2007, and he knows government from the inside. Please welcome Bart Peterson to the podium.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a great privilege to be here, and I want to say thank you to Mary as well and to Research America for bringing us all together here today. This is a great opportunity to discuss some very, very important issues around the future of research and development in our country. And I'm very proud that Lilly is able to be the lead sponsor for today's gathering. As John mentioned, in my former life, I was mayor of Indianapolis, and I never worried too much about whether Indianapolis would be on the map 50 years from now. We were clearly the dominant city in the state of Indiana with a diverse economy, but as I was mayor of Indianapolis, I looked around our state, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Indiana is dotted with cities of 40,000, 60,000, 80,000 people, all built up around manufacturing. And those cities had lost their auto plants. They'd lost their refrigerator factories. They'd lost their television assembly plants. And I seriously wondered what was going to be their future. Would they be on the map 50 years from now? And if so, why? But there were some cities of the same size in Indiana that I never worried about. I didn't worry about South Bend, Indiana, or West Lafayette, or Bloomington. These are cities of 100,000 people or less, but they're home to the University of Notre Dame, Purdue University, and Indiana University. And these great research universities, along with several others in our state, gave them, I always believed, a bright future. I didn't think systematically back then about innovation and research and development the way I do now at Lilly, but I instinctively understood that this was a competitive advantage now and long into the future. The impact of R&D on our economy, first and foremost. Well, the U.S. is the global leader in innovation. I think we all know that 80% of all the world's research and development in biotech occurs in the United States, but that leadership position is threatened today. We've taken that leadership position, and by the way, that's a reversal from the way things were 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, when more research and development was occurring in this area in Europe than in the United States. We took it because we have an ecosystem that requires, we developed an innovation ecosystem, and that ecosystem requires sound public policy. From the private sector perspective, that includes solid intellectual property protection, a fair, rigorous, transparent regulatory system, market system of healthcare delivery and pricing that offers choice for patients and healthcare providers. But the public sector has a role far beyond just producing sound public policy. As John referenced, public funding for research, which is so threatened today, is absolutely critical to the future, and we care about that as much from the private sector perspective as anybody else does. Promoting collaboration, which I think can be done best when led by the public sector, and empowering patients. The stakes are very, very high. We need new medicines and we need new technologies in medicine. We all know that advances in heart health and in the fight against communicable diseases have allowed people to live longer, long enough to get Alzheimer's disease and cancer in increasing numbers. For every advance against a particular type of cancer, and there have been some remarkable ones in the last 2 generations, a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer is still as terrifying as it ever was. And as much as biopharmaceutical research and development looks like going to Vegas and putting your money down at the roulette wheel, it really does. Sometimes I think it might be a smarter economic investment to do that. But in spite of all those risks, in spite of sometimes feeling as if the scientific deck is stacked because so many efforts ultimately fail, in spite of that, there are thousands of compounds in development across this country, across the world indeed, but especially here in the United States. You know, it's not just for the heroes of yesteryear to be lauded for what they have done, but I believe that we have the opportunity as well to change the course of human history, to prevent diseases, to mitigate suffering, and to save lives. And the U.S. can, and I believe will, continue to lead in that effort, but only if we do the right thing. And we're going to talk about what the right thing here is today. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Bart, for starting us off with a challenge that is real and necessary. You know, the stakes are indeed high, and we can get there. So now I want to introduce the moderator for our first panel. We're going to really keep moving here today and ask that you understand that there will be food service throughout, but it'll be at minimal level of interruption. But we do just want to get started and get right into that straight talk. So I'm so pleased to introduce the moderator of our first panel, Eleanor Clift. And you know Eleanor as the irrepressible and indispensable voice on the McLaughlin Group. But you also know that she, as a contributor to Newsweek and the Daily Beast, continues her voice and is being heard nationwide, writing about politics and policy in Washington and having covered every presidential campaign since 1976. I hope you're writing lots of books, too, or are about to, Eleanor. Eleanor's on several boards and takes seriously an obligation to the patient and voluntary sector, including service on the National Hospice Foundation Board. So please welcome Eleanor Clift and all the members of our first panel, if you'll come up.
Okay. Well, I'll start talking while they take their seats. The title of this panel is Biomedical Research and Development in America. Will it flourish or flounder? And my goal, I'm told, is to get each of the panelists to say something meaningful, to get them to leave their talking points behind and give you all a takeaway from this discussion. And to set the stage, as soon as Mary Woolley asked me if I would do this, I'm an old print journalist, and so I keep clippings, and this is from September 4th, and it does quote Dr. Francis Collins, who is here today, calling 2013 the, quote, darkest ever year for the agency, whose budget is at its lowest inflation-adjusted appropriations level in more than a decade. The agency has been awarding grants to an increasingly smaller sliver of applicants as well. And the article went on to quote, let's see, where find this, a researcher who said he had felt the impact of the budget wars. Stephen Salzberg, the director of the Center for Computational Biology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and a lauded biomedical researcher. He said that he had received about 20% less in federal funding than his peers and recommended for his work on the biological, than what was recommended for his work on the biological underpinnings of cancer and other diseases. And here's the money quote. Less science is getting done. That means cures won't emerge. 5 years from now, when your aunt gets cancer and you can't do anything for her, people won't stop and think, Jesus, if we only hadn't had the sequester. Well, we have the sequester, and it's up to everybody to try to figure out how to make do in this brave new world. So I want to start with Margaret Hamburg, the FDA commissioner, an agency that is often portrayed, at least to people like me who read the newspapers, as at odds with the industry. And depending on your perspective, either safeguarding our health or preventing valuable drugs from getting to the market. And I noticed that you recently asked your senior leaders to report back in 3 months on their ideas for adapting the FDA to, quote, the unparalleled challenges and demands of the 21st century. Can you elaborate on those challenges and what kind of reforms you're seeking and the sort of the urgency that is behind that request?
I can, though I also want to speak to the bigger question, if I may,
Sure.
Because I think it's really important to understand, and it was just commented on by the last speaker, our keynote, that there really is an ecosystem here, and we have to, as a nation, address the challenges before us as an integrated whole with a real comprehensive strategy. Investments in research are key. We need to make sure that we are adequately investing in research and making the right investments. We have to look at economic policies, we have to look at reimbursement policies, and we have to look at regulatory policies and pathways. Obviously, I have direct responsibility for those issues that fall within the domain of the regulatory realm. And from day one of my commissionership, we've been working hard to address those issues. And I firmly believe that advancing innovation and protecting health can go hand in hand, and in fact they do. And that our role is not only to work with the scientific community, both in academia and in industry, to really identify where are the promises in science and technology today, and how can we leverage them into real-world products? How can we do the research from the very beginning in ways that support the regulatory requirements and enable us to, really make the best use of now increasingly limited dollars as we build on discoveries and move them across the finish line into the products that matter for people. So that's one important issue in really advancing regulatory science so that we have a comprehensive scientific approach that assures that the critical questions for knowing the efficacy and safety of a product and the overall risk benefit, for knowing that a product can be reliably manufactured and is stable, and knowing that throughout the life cycle of that product it's being overseen to support the assessments of safety and efficacy and make adjustments along the way as necessary, is one important aspect. The other important aspect of what we're doing at FDA is to really streamline and modernize our systems, our business practices, our ways of engaging with partners so that we are really doing our work as effectively and efficiently as possible, so that when a company with a promising drug calls, someone returns the phone call, so that when questions are asked about are we on the right track in terms of the information that they need, someone will be responsive, and to make sure that we are playing our part to move things through the system, and we're seeing the time frames declining in terms of regulatory review.
But there are persistent complaints, though, that the demands for the number of people to be engaged in clinical trials are unrealistic, and patients who feel who are willing to undergo a certain amount of risk to get at drugs. Is any of that under
Well, this has been a
review?
constant tension, and I would say, I think you'll hear from members of both the research community and industry their reflections on how FDA is doing. I think that we have made very solid progress in terms of trying to really look at what are our requirements and are they necessary. We have to undertake robust scientific analysis. We need to make sure that we understand the array of issues with respect to safety and efficacy, but we also have to be realistic, and we have actually supported a lot of work externally in partnership with industry and academia, and done a lot internally to really look at how can we develop more innovative clinical trial approaches, how can we decrease the time for clinical research to be done, the number of patients. Ultimately, for all of us, that also means the costs of the products and the costs to the developers. There's a lot of mythology about the FDA. I frequently sit on a panel like this and someone will say, FDA requires 2 clinical trials to approve a drug, or FDA won't accept data from other countries. And I say, well, actually, that's not really true. And they said, no, it is. And I said, well, actually, I'm in a position to have some insights on this.
Right.
But there's a lot of mythology. We're making progress. Certainly, there have been concerns, and there are continuing concerns. And some of these are very hard scientific challenges. How do you assess adequately the long-term safety when someone is using a drug not for days but for decades? And that's where we need to work together as a scientific community to figure out what are the best ways to ask and answer those critical questions for the benefit of the American people.
I see you nodding your head and you're waving to get in. So robust progress. Bart Peterson, is she right about that?
I think there has been a lot of progress. I can think back to when I joined the company just a little over 4 years ago, and the sort of the constant refrain we heard throughout the industry was, look at the data. The number of drug approvals each year from FDA is going down. There are fewer and fewer each year. The relationship is more difficult, more surprises, less consistency. Those are the kind of things you used to hear across the industry. And I think a lot has changed. And now we have, there always has to be, when people talk about the relationship between the regulated and the regulator.
There has to be some
it's
tension.
Right.
Right.
It shouldn't be a comfortable relationship. Because there is regulation that has to be imposed by law, and the regulatees aren't always going to like it. So there are ways in which we can partner, and we work together to negotiate some of the changes that were enacted in the last couple of years by Congress that have changed the rules with regard to consultation between the FDA and the industry when approvals or when submissions are pending. The number of approvals has significantly gone up each year in the last several years, and I think there's a lot of agreement around a lot of things and a lot of improvement generally. So I think the environment has changed in the last few years. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's some of the new things, that newly enacted things, haven't really had a chance to be tested yet, but I think the spirit is positive.
And if you think budget issues at NIH are dire, FDA has a few budget challenges too in order to fulfill our really critical and unique mandate.
Right.
What I was going to add, and hopefully a very positive add, is that as part of the new rules and regulations, the FDA has come out with breakthrough therapy indications. And here, for drugs that show extraordinary promise, and not necessarily in a large number of patients, the tables have changed dramatically, where now the FDA and the pharmaceutical companies actually work in partnership to do everything possible to get the drugs to the patients as soon as conceivably possible. And one of our drugs that just received such a thing will probably be approved 2 years earlier than we had anticipated, which means a drug with significant benefit can get to patients earlier. I think that kind of partnership is really very, very promising, very constructive.
So there's progress made in this country within the budgetary restraints, and yet I think there is a feeling that America's kind of losing its edge. Other countries, I was struck by David Cameron, the UK. He's using his position as president of the G8 to launch this first ever global summit to look at combating Alzheimer's. And then the CEO initiative, which is recently formed in this country, of international corporations. George Vredenberg, who I'm sure a lot of you in this room know, he wants to try to bridge the gap between the private and public sector to create this sort of unified plan to stop Alzheimer's disease, and he set a goal of 2025. Can you speak about, the sort of the pricing perspective of drugs in this country, and the research that's being done vis-a-vis what's happening globally?
But I think, Eleanor, we're not going to lose our competitive advantage in the biomedical space, if ever, for many, many years, and we won't lose it as long as we continue to encourage risk and innovation. And when 3 or so years ago, when the movie about our family came out, based on our journey with our kids, Megan and Patrick, through the rare diseases, it was a very unique time in our life, and we got to travel the world and talk about the film and our family's journey. And we were talking actually to an Italian reporter, and she asked, could this have happened in Italy? And I'm half Italian, so I want to be very respectful. But I said, actually, in all fairness, I don't think it could have, because there's something very uniquely American about what happened, and it was all the different pieces of the puzzle coming together. Patients, families, entrepreneurs, venture capital, the NIH, university researchers, the FDA, all of it was essential. And maybe it would have happened someplace else, but it happened best and fastest, I really believe, here because of this unique environment, this ecosystem that we have. The challenge has been since 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, and so many changes in the world, that we've had a risk-off mentality, and that really shook the foundations of biomedical research. Not as many funds for government, not as many funds in academic research, venture capital into startup companies basically drying up, and we were in a crisis in 2010. So by that point, we started to think, we have to reinvent the model. And a good part of it was FDA in the middle and the regulations. Bart talked about playing a game of roulette. It's actually a pretty fair analogy to biotechnology. Your risk tolerance changes with alcohol as well. But I could tell you, when you look, and many other factors. But when you actually step back and think about it, at least there, we know what the rules and the odds are. Here it was never clear. So when we came to PDUFA 5, and eventually when the commissioner testified, others came to the table and said, yes, we have to change how we play the game and set the rules and give the guidance. We put in place PDUFA 5 and FDASIA and all these other legislative tools. And I really think at the core what they have done in the last year is to help spark that innovation again in America. And, you know, Commissioner, your leadership has been tremendous in the rare diseases, but in oncology and other spaces in moving therapies forward, and breakthrough designation is a key part of that. So I think the future is bright. We've moved from crisis to crossroads. There's a lot of work still to be done. There's a lot of culture and organizational changes still at FDA, but in industry as well. So when you think about pricing then, on one hand, you know, medicine will always cost much to develop. It is going to always be a difficult environment. Much of what we do will never work, and that R&D needs to be paid for. But we also need to be responsible with that, and we see that with the extraordinary prices of rare disease drugs. I'm hopeful with more innovation and more competition that we can have more responsible and more effective pricing as well. So I think that will change.
For those who aren't familiar with your story, we chatted a little bit outside. You said you were the son of a cop, and this kind of launched you into a world that you didn't know a whole lot about. Can you tell us briefly what your story is, and also the perspective as the patient advocate, and then your move into industry and the two sides of the coin?
We have 3 children. 2 were born with a rare genetic disease. Megan, who's now 16, Patrick, who's now 15. But we were originally told when they were diagnosed that there were no treatments, there were no cures, and enjoy the time you have. They may live a few years. So like many patients and parents in the world, you're thrust into this world of research. And we began as a not-for-profit, eventually became frustrated at the pace of research, helped to join with a researcher, start a small biotechnology company that we eventually sold to Genzyme, which successfully developed the first treatment, and Commissioner and I were talking about this earlier as well, not a cure, but a treatment. So that launched me on a path of being an entrepreneur. And you know, I used to say, Eleanor, I wore 2 hats. One is the dad of 2 very special kids, and one is an entrepreneur in biotech. But I actually think it's 1 hat today. And I think when we think about patient advocacy at our company, Amicus, we try to think about not about how do we influence the patient community, but at every step of the decision process, whether we put a new drug in the clinic, whether we invest millions or tens of millions in an R&D effort, we think about if you were a patient sitting at this table, at this boardroom, or the dad of a mom of a patient, would you be excited about this? Even though you realize it's risky, it may likely not work. But is this truly innovative, breakthrough medicine? And we need to think more like that as an industry, and then partner with FDA to advance it. So that's how our family's journey at least influenced my perspectives.
Well, in doing my research for this panel, I learned a lot about public-private partnerships, one that really struck me was Onyx Pharmaceutical teaming up with the University of California at San Francisco, called the Oncology Innovation Alliance. And I think they have another similar alliance with the University of Texas at Austin. And I ask you about that. Is this something that's happening throughout the industry, and is this even more essential given these tight budgetary times?
Yes, absolutely. The power of collaboration is absolutely critical. And you know, one of the reasons I said in my opening remarks that the public sector can provoke or promote collaboration a little easier than the private sector can is, you know, there are competitive issues between multinational biopharmaceutical companies, and just as there are between medical device companies, and so where that line is between pre-competitive collaboration and when you get into the competitive realm is something that it's not always easy for us to see as clearly as it is perhaps somebody looking on the outside, sort of prodding us to work more closely together. That's when I talk about cooperation and collaboration among big companies or big companies and biotechs. But in terms of collaboration and cooperation with academia, that is the heart and soul of our industry. And we wouldn't exist without that. And it really is a symbiotic relationship. universities don't develop drugs because they don't have the infrastructure to do that. We do that. We also work on early stage discovery. They do as well. They develop technologies that we're able to license or to collaborate on. And it does happen across the industry, and it's absolutely essential. And because so much of the research money that universities use comes from the NIH, that's why the issue of NIH funding levels is so critical to the entire ecosystem.
If I were to ask each of you what the top priority is to spur innovation and what the biggest obstacle is, how would you answer that? If we could do a quick.
Well, there's one thing that I see that may or may not be the top, but it worries me, and it's I think a very important cultural shift that should worry a lot of people, I hope. When I was training in medical school, a very good place, it was your highest calling to become a medical researcher, to emulate the faculty that was teaching you. And I can remember, even as a resident, sneaking off to the lab to try to get some work done. I even remember Francis carrying the bucket of ice late at night with samples as we were striving to make a contribution in taking what we're learning about basic science and applying that to the care of patients. Today, if you go to medical schools, even top medical schools in the country, you don't consistently see that. The faculty is under such pressure to raise clinical revenue, which I think is a losing proposition for them, but they try, that and the NIH funding, because of the points that Francis and others have made, is so tough that the people training don't see this as a career. And if you lose these kids who are so smart and so talented, who's going to be the next generation that continues to spur on biomedical research and the prevention and cures we seek in this country? The pharmaceutical companies will look everywhere in the world. Trust me. We're not limited. But we want to see, as Americans, the U.S. to continue to be the leaders. And what I'm seeing, because of a variety of factors, we're losing that generation, and that's a real problem.
Boy, that's a clear warning. And is it the reduced grants and lack of resources that is the main thing, or is there sort of inspiration is missing too?
I think it's multifactorial. When you see a couple of things have happened, one is sort of the unforeseen, unanticipated consequences of the Libby Zion case, which many of you are familiar.
I was an intern at New York Hospital when it happened.
Where suddenly the faculty now spends more time writing notes at night than the house staff because of responsibilities for making sure that faculty members are intimately involved in every detail of patient care. Maybe that's a good thing.
For those who aren't familiar with that, is everybody familiar with that case?
Well, it was a terrible, terrible tragedy where a young woman came to the emergency room and basically was admitted and died. I think she had cholecystitis or something like that.
Ear infection.
Ear infection, and died. And at the end of the day, it was realized that the attending physician had never actually seen her. She was seen by house officers, something like that, Margaret, I think. And that led to the question, well, how often does that happen? So now faculty have greater clinical responsibilities for good reasons, but they're also trying to make budget gaps by seeing more and more patients. They're not able to devote their time to research. Add to that the difficulties in funding, especially for physician scientists doing translational research, tougher and tougher. And the students and the house officers see the struggles, and they think to themselves, is this a career for me?
Right. Wow.
Just to throw one idea out, Eleanor, we need to move medicines quickly into and through the clinic, so time, cost, efficiencies will be increasingly important, especially as we understand more about this human genome and how does it apply to medicine. We work, of course, with FDA, EMEA, but we also work extensively with hospital review boards. And I can tell you, we spend an enormous amount of time, money, energy, focus, trying to harmonize the views of dozens of different academic institutions. Even in the rare diseases, to give an example, we have a lead program in a disease called Fabry disease, rare disease of maybe a few thousand people. In one of our phase 3 studies, about 60 patients, we needed specific types of patients, including those never before treated by medicines. So to do that, we had to go to 37 countries to find 60 patients, which meant that we had to deal, I forget what the overall number was, but basically about 60 different hospital review boards, and it took 2 years of work to finish all of that. Far more energy and cost than we spent with the government regulators. So I think the more we can do to harmonize that IRB system, institutional review board system, will go a great way toward accelerating research.
Thank you.
And I think, you know, the frame of your question was really what are the barriers to advancing innovation? And I think, you know, from where I sit, my concern is that as a nation, we really make sure that we have everything aligned properly to support the advancement of innovation and the leveraging of the kinds of scientific opportunities that exist today. And that isn't happening, and I think that can potentially really undermine both our ability to deliver on science and the ability of our nation to maintain its preeminence in this important arena. And I really do think that it means that we have to look at who are the key stakeholders and what are the key barriers in each of those domains of activity. And I touched on this earlier, but I think it's just so key. The science can be fabulous, and we certainly are seeing products that reflect just critical new insights into the underlying mechanisms of disease and drugs that are designed to address that. And when we see that, certainly at the FDA, we can approve those very quickly. You mentioned Onyx, you know, there was an Onyx product recently that fit that example through the collaboration you were mentioning. But there are many things that limit the ability of that science to actually come forward, and we can only review what's in the pipeline and crosses our threshold. But the steps that go into the decision to invest in the science, invest in the product, develop it through all of the steps required and all of the uncertainty, and then the question of will it even be paid for once it gets into the marketplace, influence decisions that happen very early on and can limit or catalyze important innovation. And so I really do think this is a critical time for our nation to really look at what is our national strategy to advance biomedical product innovation. Are we doing all the things that are necessary? Can we do more? And I think we're watching other nations really take on this challenge, and we need to be leading the pack.
And who would craft that national strategy? Is that something that would come from the White House, or?
I think it can, and I've certainly been engaged in discussions about how we can do that. And you know, we're working on pieces of it from other perspectives as well. Some of the people in this room have been working with me on trying to push for it. It's much bigger than the FDA, but it's really, really important. And since, you know, my goal as FDA commissioner is to help make sure that we are delivering on the promise of science and technology today, I see this as part of my mission, even though many of the pieces of this ecosystem for advancing biomedical product innovation are far outside our area of activity.
And with Congress squabbling about whether they can even come up with a continuing resolution to keep the government open, you mentioned earlier that you were feeling the brunt of sequestration. Can you be specific about how that affects the agency and potentially how it affects the public?
For us, it's sequestration, and it's more. You know, we work closely with industry in some key areas to identify what we think are important activities and programs, and then we do get through a fairly elaborate process of negotiation and engagement with the Hill. Through legislation, we get user fees to support specific programs, and we have targets and measures that we're held accountable on as well in terms of this program. And we recently passed, it was mentioned, PDUFA 5 was the pharmaceutical drug user fee agreement, part of a broader piece of legislation for the FDA that established some important new programs and activities. But in that, we get an allotment of money And there's a certain escalation each year as we expand programs and cost of living. Well, in this budget environment, unfortunately, when they're continuing resolutions, it means that we have to be held at one budget level when we have agreed on increases in the budget level. And in addition to our surprise, I think the surprise of Congress as well, surprise of industry too, the user fee dollars are being sequestered at the same level that the budget authority, the government dollars, are being sequestered. So that also is an unexpected and unfortunate hit. And then we have what in Washington is always fondly referred to as unfunded mandates as well. And this exciting new program, the Breakthrough Regulatory Pathway, that enables us to identify promising candidates very early and treat them differently in a much more human and dollar resource intensive way, actually was not funded at all. So that's a really exciting program that's already making a difference and will deliver. As you said, you think there's a product that will actually make it into the marketplace years earlier as a result of these efforts, but yet they are vulnerable in this current budget climate.
And I want to give you a chance, the biggest priority to push innovation forward and biggest obstacle.
I agree with everything that's said, so I'll add a new one, which is the importance of continuing to elevate the voice of the patient. Everybody's perceived as having an interest, in the decisions that are made, whether it's about funding for research or about the performance of the FDA or about anything else. Everybody's perceived to have sort of a self-interest. Patients obviously have a self-interest, and I think historically patients were somewhat dismissed as not being sophisticated enough. Obviously, they want cures, but they don't understand how complex these regulatory processes are. They don't understand the science. They don't understand how long it takes to develop drugs, this and that. And the reality is that's just not true anymore. Patient advocacy groups have become very sophisticated, very much at the cutting edge of scientific research, and have a voice that I think can be more powerful than any other voice in pushing us forward, pushing us beyond what we might think we can do when we look at things from our own silo point of view. So I think this is an area where it's been moving in the right direction. Right. I think it needs an even greater push from every source.
I have a friend involved in the cystic fibrosis. I think they've raised $1 billion and really
and they have helped move the science and product development in extraordinary ways.
Right,
and partnered directly, Eleanor, in that case, CF with industry.
Right, exactly.
You asked about where the leadership could come from, and it probably could come from many different places for such a strategy, but in 1971, when our dear President Nixon signed the National Cancer Act, which launched the so-called War on Cancer, it is now 41, 42 years later, and we are seeing enormous benefits from that year in and year out multi-billion-dollar investment in cancer research that has led to fundamental understanding of cancer that we never had before, which allows us to make drugs that are no longer as toxic and as miserable as chemotherapy, that in some cases are even more effective. Mm-hmm. It takes that kind of push, and that sustained push. The NCI budget, is over $5 billion a year for many, many years. That's what it takes, and it takes sticking with it.
I think we were able to go to the audience here for some questions, and while people are thinking of what they might want to ask, I just want to, this morning on NPR there was a story about a cancer researcher, oncologist at Seattle Children's Hospital who had raised $8 million on his own from patients, families, and whatever to fund his research. Is this the wave of the future?
I certainly hope not.
It's both wonderful and terrifying.
I hope not.
Crowdsource funding, even for medical research.
One of the things that's so important in all this is the peer review process. And there are physicians who have patients who love them, but they may or may not necessarily do the best research. But yet they may raise a lot of money to do research. It's so important that the peer review process that the NIH and other agencies have in place remains the way that most research is funded.
But especially in a world of competing dollars, there are going to be potentially valid projects that fall through. So creative financing could play a role.
Right, right, right. Well, the product that he had brought along was made from the venom of some lizard, I think it was, if anybody else heard it. And it adheres to cancer cells. And when you're operating in the brain, when you want to get good margins, you don't take healthy tissue. And it was a very moving story, I must say. So, so creativity can come from anywhere. So, yes, here's a question.
I have a question for Mr. Crowley. I understand that you and other patient
I
organizations.
think they may have a microphone for you. I'm sorry.
I understand that you and other patient organizations, particularly the National Health Council, has been involved with legislation, the Modern Cures Act. And could you tell us a little bit about your involvement in that and what that legislation does?
Yeah, there have been different pieces of the puzzle, if you will, that have come together over the last couple of years that will basically help to enable FDA and also provide further incentives for industry, where when you take all of it together, I think are going to provide the environment to promote biomedical research. So, without commenting on any specific piece of legislation, I could tell you a lot of people in the patient world, industry, other places have been involved. Much of that was included in last year's PDUFA 5 and FDASIA, but there are other still pieces of the puzzle that need to come together to provide more of the incentives. And again, we need all government funding for this. In part, that's very important. But in addition, it's really and largely how do you fund research through the private sector and create those incentives, much as was done with the Orphan Drug Act 30 years ago that led to the establishment of an entire orphan industry.
Congress over the years has actually been quite receptive to funding for medical research. But with the sort of across-the-board budget cuts, it doesn't leave a whole lot of discernment for what you cut and what you don't cut. And I certainly know your chairman, John Portman, was very active and behind a lot of positive measures on Capitol Hill for a long time. Too bad he's not still up there. Anyway, over here.
Hi, this is a question for Commissioner Hamburg, and if anybody else wants to jump in, please do so. I've got two questions. One, yesterday you sent out an email asking directors at the FDA to try to come up with plans to streamline. We kind of heard a little bit about that earlier. I was wondering if you had any specific ideas of what you would like to see to try to streamline. And secondly, we're talking about PDUFA user fees and how it might affect the FDA. So far from what I've been seeing is that the FDA has been able to push out its reviews pretty well. But do you see an impending timeline where the lack of being able to get the user fees will affect how you are able to review drugs or devices?
Okay, two very different questions. I'll try to be quick. The first one, I think you're referring to the same activity that actually Eleanor Cliff also referenced in her first question to me, and it actually is focused on a somewhat different set of issues than we're talking about today, but important issues in terms of our FDA component that is really sort of the on-the-ground inspectorate that is involved with issues of inspections, compliance, and enforcement. Our regional offices around the world that obviously interact with stakeholders in important ways and fulfill this important activity of really assuring that the products that are being manufactured wherever they are being produced in accordance with a set of important standards, that there's information going back and forth and engagement about FDA expectations, and rapid response when problems occur, et cetera. Historically, this network that are part of our Office of Regulatory Affairs were sort of general staff that, to sort of caricature it a little bit, one day, if you're based in our regional office in the Oakland Bay Area, might go into a biotech company to do a good manufacturing practices inspection. Another day might head up to a rice processor and do an inspection there. Well, in the modern era, the kinds of knowledge and expectations, experience, and training to do those kinds of different tasks are very, very different. And so we're trying to really modernize, professionalize, better utilize staff, and provide ultimately a better service to our stakeholders in terms of the jobs that we do. So we're looking at how we can better organize and train and staff and support, and especially in a globalized world, because the products that we oversee are coming increasingly in whole or in part from other countries. We're importing the things we regulate are coming from more than 150 countries, and often countries with very different regulatory standards, putting a whole new burden on us to be able to oversee these products. And it is very, very challenging, but crucially important if we're going to fulfill our mission to promote and protect health. With respect to the user fee questions, we have been trying very hard to maintain our level of activity and accomplishment despite constraints on our budget, but we are feeling it. People are stretched very thin, and we are worried both that we won't be able to do as much and we won't be able to, in fact, retain some of our best people if we're just working them too hard, because these experts that are doing reviews are also the experts that are engaging at various stages of development with companies as they're trying to define and implement their research agenda. They're also the people that are putting together the guidances for industry to help them have a better understanding of how they should be approaching certain problems. So they are stretched very thin. And so I think this is we are pushing towards some very difficult challenges and things that will have an impact on our ability to achieve our internal goals and our ability to really fulfill the expectations of our stakeholders.
Well, the lunch is arriving. I'm going to let Bart Peterson here have the final word.
Well, this is not exactly a profound final word. I just did want to follow up on that and say that there is a lot of sentiment, bipartisan sentiment on Capitol Hill, that the sequester shouldn't be applied to non-taxpayer funds. And I think a sentiment to try to do something about that. We have seen that in at least one case something was done about sequestered funds that were unpopular. But having said that, it's pretty hard to predict that this is an issue that might get addressed individually. But I do think there's a broad recognition that this doesn't make a lot of sense to take away this non-taxpayer money that is helping the FDA be able to move therapies along faster.
All right, I want to thank the panelists. I learned something, and a surprising amount of accord among everyone as to what needs to be done, and even if it has to be done on a shoestring. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah, well,
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Got a number of good points there. Excellent.